tere, ilusat pärastlõunat teile kõigile. Vist pean ka siia allapoole tulema.
Good afternoon. Today and yesterday we have heard a lot of the world around the Vikings and all the other interesting stories which characterized the time and the Salme finding. I'm going to speak about the sadder part, how people died in Salme. Though the map has been shown several times already, but it was the time when people moved around very actively. You see the trading routes and raiding routes, and next the old map about the settlements. And as we know, people die and the burial sites can be found. And actually their sources I am studying, these are the skeletons and bones of people in these graves. In connection with the Viking culture, there are both graves, whether they are boat-shaped or people buried in the boats. And it was said already that usually 1-2 persons were buried in the boat, but there are also graves with 3 or 4 persons. Here you see 4 persons, 2 women, 1 man, and a child. Why we are interested in that issue? When we found the first Salme boat, we determined 7 persons buried there. We studied the literature and we didn't find any material with 7 people buried in one boat. I'm not going to speak much about their Salme first boat. There were no such injuries. Later, I studied their bones. I found 1 bone with a sharp injury. Here you see the photo where the contour of the boat is seen. And now again I show the same picture you've seen already, and I want to draw your attention to the following. The 3 where their bodies were placed. Here 1 foot, which we saw on in the photos, and here their left bone, hip bone was placed, but this is very hypothetical. In the article it is written that there were a lot of bones here. Then we presume that 2 the oldest persons were buried here. But this is not my real topic. Let's take the next one. You've seen this photo already, but I think this is a very nice photo. And actually, from this point to this one, beneath there is a ship. And we started to dig further, and then regular bones and skeletons were found. The dog, you heard that we found the dog as the first one. And beneath the middle layer and the first bones. Here in the middle layer, both rows of bones are seen. And actually their brothers were buried here as the second layer. The 4 brothers are on top of the others. And it's interesting to state that in this first row and on top, 2 bodies were buried. And actually, he was a remote relative of the brothers. And one more photo. It characterizes different layers of their grave and their position of the feet. And after we had found that both, we tried to find some parallels in other places of war, graves, how people have treated the Vikings elsewhere when they were strangers to the local culture. And we read a lot of different materials. First, on the British Isles, there are 2 places with Viking graves. Vikings in Repton, mass grave in Derbyshire, and the other is related to massacre where Danes were killed. This is Repton mass grave. It's a mixture of bones, and the other Ridgeway Hill. All the Danes were killed there, and their heads were cut from the bodies. Now, their war graves. This is Visby battle grave. Around 2,000 people were killed there. It's not a pattern-like one. This is a grave from Denmark, Sandbjerget, dating 1,300 to 1,350. There is no regular pattern. Sigtuna mass grave, where the bodies have no pattern in the grave. And Tim also mentioned that also in Towton mass grave there is no certain pattern, rather a rational positioning. And this is an original drawing made by Jan Oswald. And here you see the direction of the position of the skeletons. But now let's speak about their injuries. Why this object was so interesting. The first skeleton, we saw their very serious injuries, and this body was stabbed 11 times, and the right shoulder bone was chopped off. And we see the cuts here. And on the skull, 2 blade injuries. And here behind, 1 more injury on the surface. And in this example, obviously when the person fell down, maybe he was protecting himself with the feet, because in his left calcaneus there is also a wound. Maybe he was also stabbed with a sword in the back, and he had serious back injuries up to his lungs. And I would like to say also that he was decapitated. And here, this is the cut, and here is their trace. Now, skeleton B. He had also blade injuries on their skull in the first part, on the forehead, and a sword cut. No metacarpal. Maybe he wanted to protect himself with the right hand, and here we see the injuries of metacarpal. And now about the skeletons we haven't mentioned before. I use letters for the skeletons, and this is skeleton A. Both legs were cut off from above knee. His feet are in a very unnatural position, and both of these bones were cut off above the knee, and the left part, one more piece was cut off because the weapons were extremely sharp at that time. And from here you see the traces of the cut on the femoral head. One more skeleton, which hasn't been shown before, skeleton G. And we found that this skeleton had multiple skull injuries, at least 2 strikes on the left side of the skull. Next photo. Maybe it's difficult for you to follow because there were so many pieces of skull. But here we see also one injury, which was at the back of the head. And that was a very clear cut scene. When we study the skeletons with injuries, in case they have injuries, there are multiple injuries. Now skeleton X, again, multiple blade injuries on the skull. One piece of their jaw was cut off. The piece is here. At the same time, it had also injuries here on the skull. I reconstructed the places of these cuts. Very many injuries. And skeleton G, decapitated and several other injuries. You see several cuts near the neck. And later on, when we studied these bones, he had been injured several times in the neck. Here we see that on the skull. It had also a trace of the weapon. I can't judge the weapons. And also arrowhead was found in their bones. And skeleton G, continuation, blade injuries related to decapitation, at least 2 blows to the throat. 1 blow cut spine between 2nd and 3rd vertebra. And now their favorite of archaeologists, skeleton L. Some people call it the king. Here, 2 bones were together. He had his inborn problem, occipital bone and neck vertebra. And there were some presumptions that it might have been a king. And now skeleton blade injuries. Left proximal ulna and left femoral head, anterior side. The injury doesn't seem to be very serious at the first sight, but injuries on the bone, it may mean that very important blood, vein, water could have been injured. And there were some 34 or 33 skeletons in their boat. 14 of them had sharp force traumas, and of them 8 had at least 2 traumas. Maximum 11 bladed blows a skeleton A, and 4 skeletons have evidence of decapitation. There were also arrowheads in the bodies, and in 5 of them, arrowheads could be connected to small stab or puncture wounds. For example, in the hip, and both the injury and the arrowhead could be seen. I'm not a specialist of weapons, but I think that most of the stabs were made by swords. And one is most likely inflicted by an axe. And here, an illustration in which parts of the skull there were injuries. These stabs which I showed before. And if we take the whole skeleton, here we see where the injury is situated on the body. This table, I don't know how well you can see it, but I compiled that table where the skull injuries are seen and also the injuries of the rest of the bodies. And a certain pattern was found. Injuries on the skull, mostly in the frontal part, and piercing, and on the left side of the skull. I have read that this may refer to face-to-face fighting, combating. If we take the rest of the skeletons except skulls, then mostly horizontal strikes into their limbs, and on the back side of the body, piercing, and a bit more on the right side. If the person is attacked from behind, there is no big difference whether the injury is on the right or left. Now, most targeted body parts in Salme II, mostly head and the upper part of the jaw and upper extremities. The other parts, lower extremities, pelvic area, neck area, they were less influenced. But this thorax area, it's underestimated because in many skeletons, this part hasn't been preserved, and therefore it's difficult to find out and determine whether there were injuries in the thorax area or not. Cranial injuries in different battle graves. I tried to compare their battle funerals. If we take their cranial injuries, in case of war graves, very often the left skull is mostly affected, and Salme is no exception. And very often the skull injuries penetrating. And they might be on the front side or back side, it varies. But also the authors may interpret it differently, either on the front side or back side. And actually, it's all. Thank you very much.
Aitäh ja ka sulle.
Thank you very much. And a present for you too.
Are there any questions about the injuries?
Thank you, Raili. You mentioned that 14 out of the 34 skeletons in Salme II have sharp force trauma, which means that 20 don't. So the 20 that don't have sharp force trauma, do they have blunt force trauma or no trauma? And if they have no trauma, are they in a specific part of the ship, bearing in mind that there are the different layers of bodies?
I didn't look at the blunt trauma. I saw in some cases, but I didn't investigate it. So my answer is I don't know. But if we look at the sharp force trauma, for example, it's especially well pronounced on the top layer of skeletons, of course, and also in the middle layer, where this skeleton L is and the first row in the middle layer. There are more injuries. And there is no specific pattern, I would say.
Okay, thanks.
One comment on blunt force trauma, because the skulls in most cases are very badly preserved. I think that if one day one expert will come on blunt force trauma, I would be very happy, because I understand that, for example, in Towton it was done, but it's not done for Salme.
Thank you. This is something that Tim might be able to comment on. Is there anything to be said about the level of head protection in those head battle statistics compared to Towton, number of strikes per number of head wounds, versus the number of strikes and the number of head wounds in Salme?
This very ugly table was about it, but you couldn't see it. In Towton, in my opinion, it was over 3 blows on the skull. Am I right, Tim?
3 what, sorry?
Blows.
Tim?
Yeah, they range from 1 or 2.
In my opinion.
Yeah, they range from 1 or 2 to, for most individuals. The most is 14.
Mm-hmm.
So and there are sharp point trauma, sharp force trauma, and blunt force trauma. Sharp edge trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a bit of everything. But I must admit, the preservation in Towton was about as perfect as it could be. So I can understand your problem at Saaremaa, because you need the good preservation to see the edges of the wounds and the preservation of the skull. Yeah.
It's very difficult. But as I remember, I put on my table, there was a 3.1 blows per cranium in Towton, sharp force trauma only, not including blunt force. And in Salme it was 2.4, so there is a difference.
One of the things we did know about Towton is that the individual skeletons that I showed, the ones that had been buried separately, there were at least 2 individuals there that almost certainly had helmets on. There was one individual that had a huge crack from the foramen magnum all the way up the back of the skull. So his head had been forced open, but there wasn't a single mark on it. So something had broken the skull, but there was no mark on the skull. So it's almost certainly the head was protected, but it still received a huge blow enough to crack the skull open. So again, it's because of the preservation, I think, that we've got such a difference.
Yes, and we didn't find any helmets in Salme. Actually, I have a question to archaeologists that why don't we have helmets? But we have so many swords in this Salme grave, so this is very intriguing to me, actually. Okay, thank you.